You're muted. You're muted. You're muted.
Okay, here I am.
Oh, well, good. How you doing? And Dimitri. How you doing, Javier?
Doing good. Doing good. I'm thinking a lot about a talk I had with Big Sig.
Oh,
So
Mr. Flores. Oh, delightful.
yeah,
I'd be curious.
yeah,
I really enjoyed the digital ethics, Geopadia. I think all of that, which we can associate with Holy Spirit and Zizek, I think. I can't see you, Dimitri, but I can see you in my heart, and your beautiful features are always imprinted there. But I really enjoyed it. I'd be curious how I would be curious how Mr. Flores is doing.
yeah. I mean, it's well because it's definitely connected to the video you watched with me, Michelle, and Jockin
Mm.
about Geopadia mapping, ethics onto this virtual spaces. Obviously, the conversation I had with Big Sig, super long conversation, super long.
Those are fun.
Um, yeah. It was well, one, I did, in my opinion, I don't think I did a great job articulating beauty. So I think that was one of the biggest stumbling blocks. But it was very pivotal to the conversation, as you will eventually see, um, about why it was pivotal. Because I noticed that there is this tension between psychoanalysis and something like ethics.
Mm.
Um, and a lot of it was trying to sort out, and I think this contributes to the Geopadia project in a kind of different stance
No.
point of view of like, well, if we can't agree on beauty, then we definitely won't agree on Geopadia, probably. But then there's this argument of Geopadia that perhaps could have been an argument point for beauty, of just like, because it's a real experience, right? So it's a real experience. As people experience it, I think people want that. Um, Now I haven't elaborated to Dimitri what Geopadia space is, but I'll just kind of give an example. I mean, it's basically like the net philosophy portal, what people desire in terms of a space to cultivate themselves versus mere productivity.
Mm.
And so it is a play on Geopadia. The way Jockin breaks it down is geo, we borrow it from geometry.
Mm.
And then padia has to do with this more Greek notion of play.
Yeah.
Um, and of course, I would say the geometric part is kind of like the geometric mean versus uh the the algebra mean, or what we like to say, everything else that we're captured in with the digital space is the algorithm.
Right.
Everything is concerned with what is the average. Ironically, the average is the most highly viewed, highly most productive, talked about topic, point of conversation, and so on, and everything, versus the geometric mean would be what? It's like, well, we mistake productivity as cultivation. So that's a huge collapse that we've done. um, for example, this idea of digital gardening. I don't know if you've heard of this. Um, yeah, digital gardening, where people want to take notes and use their what they watch and take notes. But you see, that kind of misses the more communal element. Like, why are you taking notes? Why are you doing this? Why are you doing this productivity for? That's the part that nobody kind of like gets to answer. It's just like this productivity's sake. Um, but then the argument's like, well, at least I'm not a blind consumer. It's like, well, okay, yeah, I mean that's true. That's better. It's definitely better than just consuming. Um, but then you get into like this point where even productivity itself can become empty, because then why? Why are you doing that exactly? For what? For what reason? I think you start very quickly start hitting the nihilistic point of a kind of mistaking productivity or pure productivity as cultivation.
I very much like the distinction between productivity and cultivation. I think that's very useful. I mean, a lot of people, Scolay, leisure, Piper, will talk about that a reason you have to defend spaces of leisure is precisely to be able to tell the difference between cultivation and productivity. Mr. Luper, it is good to see you. We've been having a conversation ever since the stumping ground on this kind of way of using the algorithm and the digital to create spaces of interaction that has a very different quality than what the algorithm would have us go in. In Belonging Again, too, we talk about the difference between discourse and rhetoric. I would associate the discourse with the algorithm. Also, Kafka is the literature of the algorithm for me, and the alternative I've also talked about as voicecraft. And actually, techno-feudalism. It's funny. I actually had a talk at VoiceCraft with Tim Adlin, Aspasia, and different people, and I love them. And we actually had a conversation precisely on techno-feudalism. That's funny you read that the other day, Dimitri, because I actually brought up a lot of the Geopadia kind of stuff in conversation with that book. And how basically it's so important that in techno-feudalism, Varoufakis argues that it's not, in a sense, techno-feudalism isn't even capitalism. It actually has killed markets. That's kind of the problem. Like, if it actually was markets, then that would be one thing, but actually it's antithetical to markets, because markets mean there's diversity of tastes. And what the algorithm wants to do is actually flatten people. If you think about it, diversity is bad for markets, because then you have to make different products, you have to make different kinds of people. But if you can flatten everyone to a more narrow range of the kind of subjects people are, that actually can be a good thing. And there's an argument, from profit to cloud rent, and feudalism is so much based on rent and cloud capital, I think. I've heard him talk about it. I think that idea is that from, feudalism being so much based on rent is a key notion. I'll give it to Luber and then Dimitri here. And I think also, like, there's this classic idea, and McCloskey talks about this in her first book of the bourgeoisie trilogy, that there's something called bourgeoisie virtues. And it's the idea that actually, and many libertarians will make this argument, is that markets are not only good, they're actually good for us. They actually make us more ethical. That there's actually something about capitalism when it's, now I have to go through the history of this. When it starts, there's a way in which it makes you more ethical. Because if you have a store, you're kind of forced to figure out how to hang out with people or to cater to other people. And you maybe have to interact with diversity. And also, if you're stealing and cheating and different things, that could be bad for business. So there's this way in which a point that kind of Dietrich McCloskey wants to make is that there's actually some arguments that capitalism can make people more virtuous, actually. The issue is that that would necessitate markets. And if you're actually entering into a capitalism that's a techno-feudalism that uses the algorithm to kind of remove markets, then actually any sort of that kind of possibility of the bourgeoisie virtues. Now, again, one can argue against this thesis that's put it out, but you hear many libertarian people put this. Well, the virtue potential of markets as it moves to algorithm, you could say, and that's not just now, you could say that capitalism has been moving to something algorithmic since post-World War II, actually, right? So as you're doing that, it moves away from the virtuous. And by definition, that means it wants to shrink markets in order to make a more targeted product line, right? Because so you have that problem going on. And I think then that certainly is removing all cultivation is certainly more and more eclipsed by production and productivity. And Mr. Jockin, it's good to see you, sir. And I would also say there is something about, like we've talked about, is like conditions of Holy Spirit, childhood, intrinsic motivation, drive. I think also the question of ethics that you're pointing out, and I'd be curious what Mr. Flores has to say. Ethics is, in one sense, antithetical to psychoanalysis because there's the risk, just to speak very generally, of a big other, of an authority structure of whom determines the ethics. And this is why, for me, it is so critical to emphasize the surprise in the Aristotelian ethics, the unexpected element, that which cannot be predicted or systemized. The key, any ethics that are algorithmic will be in conflict with psychoanalysis because it has an algorithmic character. But precisely the critique of the algorithm is actually, I think, going to help us think the contradiction of psychoanalysis and ethics. But the critical thing is the ethics has to be bound in the surprise in the encounter itself, as I know Jockin was emphasizing in the talk, and I agree with. There's more to be said, but I'll give it to Luber and then Dimitri and see if I can speed my internet up. Mr. Luber, please. Good to see you today, sir. It was a pleasure to speak last night.
Likewise. And I'm listening to that call with Javier and got me all fucking juiced up. So I want to, first, because I know Dimitri's a Hegelian, knows 10 times more than me about Hegel. So I want to start with some hot claims, get him I just want to see what he has to say so I can like learn a little bit. Beauty isn't dialectical, first claim. So if you put it within a triad, you're already reducing the beauty on the plane of good and truth. It's outside dialectic thought because it's the surprise that generates dialectics to occur in the first place. It's what moves. It's the origin of the movement of the dialectic. And basically, I would guess speculative reasoning is being in a state of preparation mentally, which would entail what you do behaviorally, being in a state of preparation to receive that surprise, to put yourself in a position to be surprised, such that the surprise doesn't destroy you. Like that's the key, because it could destroy you. That's part of it. So then I would say, with like the question of the big other, psychoanalysis is stuck in exposition. I love psychoanalysis, but basically what I mean by that is it doesn't understand how the gap moves into another gap. It only knows how to sublate the gap, like the initial sublation, into how the gap basically changes. But it doesn't understand how, once it changes, how it continues. Because that's a different domain. That's literature, that's storytelling. That's not psychoanalysis anymore when you start thinking about how the gap moves in general, not just that initial sublation into the next gap. So basically, if I were to write a story about psychoanalysis, it would be about that they're stuck in their own ironic feedback loop in an exposition, and that they're stuck in it, and therefore they can't actually understand how the beautiful, essentially the causer, creating that aha moment where you can see, oh, it actually, the causer was present throughout the entire exposition, but behind basically that tension that the thought was residing in, what caused that tension being there the entire time, to the point where you realized it, where you're like, oh, I can actually now retroactively look back and say, yeah, that beautiful vision was actually always possible. It was always there, lingering implicitly in the background. It wasn't something that it only becomes explicit for a moment and then it goes away. And if it becomes explicit for longer than that moment and it doesn't go away, then it self-effaces. That would be part of what I'm saying, or part of the claim. And I would just say one more thing, like another takeaway. I haven't finished the talk, but another takeaway is, because I like Lacan, so I don't want to seem like I only hate Lacan, because I really like Lacan. But the question of why do you care basically is such a, like, why does psychoanalysis care? And I think that is such an important question, and not like a hysterical question, because you're asking a question based off of a tension that you cannot look away from. Like, there's a present tension that generates the psychoanalytic thought process, and to not think about why you are responding to that attention in such a way is basically not a hysteric question, because it's something that is right in front of you, present in real time, that you have to deal with. And the only way that you can deal with it is by thinking about virtue, essentially. It's like, oh, well, how I behave in relation to that tension is what's causing this thought, essentially. And like, that to me is all virtue ethics. So, and then storytelling just basically, in my opinion, is essentially understanding the psychoanalytical move in relation to virtue ethics, which would just basically mean understanding, from a psychoanalytic perspective at least, it would just mean understanding how the gap moves in time. That's what a storyteller is. The study of how the gap moves in time. And that would be my take. I'm all ears because I feel like I said definitely controversial things that, like, Daniel, you could easily disagree with, Jockin, etc. Like, so yeah.
No, I appreciate it very much. And well, first off, we can't advance in our thinking if we can't speak the places about which we are thinking about these different issues, right? If people are afraid to critique capitalism, capitalism can't improve. If people can't critique communism or psychoanalysis, et cetera, so forth, then we're in massive trouble, right? And also we should note, every single field by definition will always have something outside of it. Right? If it didn't, it wouldn't have a girdle point, and therefore the map would equal the territory and be useless. It is because every single map is wrong that we can use it, right? So you're never going to have any sort of structure of thought that is perfect, because if it was, it would be a map as big as the territory and it would crush us and it would be incomprehensible, right? So you always have that problem that you're always dealing with, as the Borges story goes on the exactitude of science. Also, I would note there is certainly a risk of one of the reasons I got upset with literature is there you go. It says that sort of knowledge of that incompleteness is incorporated into the thinking. Like, one of the reasons I got tired with literature is because it became a discourse about itself. I found a lot of trouble with economics because it became an exposition about itself. There's a tendency of fields to become exposition about itself, right? You have forms of philosophy that are expositions about themselves. So there's always this, every X can enclose and thus become an algebra. There is no variable that cannot enclose on itself and thus actually become an algorithm in the way that's being described, and thus fall into self-effacement. Theology can do it, church can do it, literature can do it, everything. And part of the question is, how do we keep any discourse, whether it be a discourse about the problem of discourses? This is always the key, is that discourses about the problems of discourses can become enclosed, right? So psychoanalysis that can help you try to keep things open itself, if one is not careful, can close, in the same way that theology about being a good Christian can actually lead to you being a bad Christian, because you actually become enclosed and you're no longer open to the man on the side of the road. So there's something here that, if we take seriously the problem is, quote unquote, the algorithm, or algebra, or discourse, or Kafka-likeness, to use all the terms that we like to use, then basically this means there is some sort of skillfulness, some sort of awareness that is required in all possible worlds, in all possible situations, that if not there, enclosure is inevitable along some point on the timeline, right? And that is my working thinking, is that all possible orientations in the world, as in there is no orientation in the world that in essence cannot become enclosed. Every possible orientation can become enclosed if one lacks a certain skillfulness. And also, when we talk about virtue ethics, there's something about virtue ethics, you could almost talk about a certain virtue skillfulness, right? Part of the problem with thinking this is that we read the word ethics and we can't help but bring with it moral dogmas from church and sort of neurotic structures of authority, right? But of course, we're talking about a certain skillfulness. So the idea that I would hold is that every X becomes an enclosure without a certain virtue skillfulness, we'll say, or a certain skillfulness, right? There is no given. There is no guarantee of any X. And by X, I mean any variable you insert it. It can always become, there is nothing that cannot become algorithm, right? Now, it's very interesting because I would also say with Lacan, like, a lot of Lacan is also responding to questions of fascism, political totalitarianism, how capital, like, people can identify with their stuff. So there's also the discourse is always already caused. I think that's important. Like, psychoanalysis is a discourse that is kind of emerging from a historic condition of, well, you could link it to Freud's War and Madness, right? Like, that essay that Freud is writing on war is a really big deal, because we, I think, sometimes underestimate the trauma of World War I on collective consciousness. And then the short 20th century to the 20th, like, Mrs. Dalloway, Ulysses, all of these novels have to be seen at this point as responding to the what the heck happened that led to this, right? And I think the psychoanalytical discourse is strongly tied to political realities that are trying to be addressed. So that would be one thing I would say, and then Dimitri can add to that. The other thing I would say is that I think perhaps Mr. Boothby would want to argue that this was why Das Ding was important in Lacan, because it maintained an opening point that then, Boothby really wants to emphasize the space of the Das Ding, this kind of field of the opening that then, as we know, Lacan moves beyond. But Boothby sees the Das Ding as very, very important. And perhaps that would be the sort of girdle point in Lacan that makes space for the virtue ethics, that makes space for thinking the beautiful. Also, I personally associate the beautiful, as Dimitri said last week, I believe, or the week before, what is the non-dialectical core of dialectics, and that's drive. And I associate beauty and drive together, which I associate with speculative reasoning, which is what is beyond dialectical thinking. You have to go through dialectics to get into speculative reasoning. So there's something about beautiful that is working on drive. And I think that's true, because once you have the Geopedic or you have the Holy Spirit, you move into something that is more of an intrinsic motivation. There's a certain drive that is going on. And then the possibility here is that Das Ding, following Boothby, and I'm not going to say I'm an expert on Boothby's thinking, but I always find his thoughts on Das Ding very interesting, that Das Ding has a lot to do with potentially orienting the drive and possibly having things to do with the beautiful. But I actually do agree, and this may be interest to you, Mr. Luber, Boothby thinks that a reason Lacan may have moved away from Das Ding, although I'm not going to say I know this for sure, is because it was too easy to associate with thinking of being. That could be associated with Heidegger, that then, of course, could be associated with Nazism, right? So there was perhaps a movement from the question of Das Ding because of concerns about that association. Whether that's right or wrong, I don't know. But these are some opening thoughts on what is being said. But I think the question that is being traced out that is extremely important, and I'll give it to Dimitri, is the relation of psychoanalysis to ethics. What kind of ethics is being described following Aristotle? How does that connect with the beautiful? And how does that connect with, quote unquote, Holy Spirit in the Zizekian sense, or the Geopadia? That seems to be this quality of experience of cultivation that is alternative to production, that also seems to be tied to Scholé, without which the extension of humanity versus our replacement by AI, our conviviality versus our manipulation following it, becomes impossible. So I think connecting these thoughts is extremely important, but I will give it to Mr. Dimitri. Mr. Dimitri, it is good to see you, sir. And I really enjoyed the things you shared about communism, Maoism, etc., so forth from weeks. I took a lot of notes for belonging again 2-3. So I appreciate it, sir. Please.
Yeah, I can recommend everyone here to read A Voice and Nothing More by Mladen Dolar. Like, yes, he's a Slovenian thinker, but he is not Zizek. He is not. He is a thinker in his own right, and his writing style is extremely valuable. Like this book, A Voice and Nothing More, like it basically contains everything that Zizek talks about in a way. Like he goes into the ethics of psychoanalysis. He called the chapters like on the ethics of the voice, how psychoanalysis relates to linguistics, how psychoanalysis relates to metaphysics, how psychoanalysis relates to politics. It's Luber, it's the book I'm having a reading group on. So I have tons of videos on this that I'm presenting on this book. If you look in the philosophy portal. Anyway, so let me. Lacan at a certain point was saying that the ethics of psychoanalysis, that was in his 4 fundamentals of psychoanalysis. The ethics of psychoanalysis is basically to not give way to your desire, so that you have to completely affirm your desire. But okay, that's one thing he said, and then he kind of left this. Because he later said that actually desire is a defense. It's a kind of prohibition against going in a certain limit of jouissance. Okay, that's just too abstract. So what does that mean? That means that, let's say you are like your desire is sparking off for a woman, but you're like too scared to talk to her, but she's so beautiful and you see her every so then and again, and you're like thinking, oh, should I say hi? Should I not say hi? Should I say hi? And you're seeing her, and each time you're being more mesmerized, right? But this is the domain of desire, insofar as your desire is already a defense. You are, in a sense, prohibiting yourself for losing yourself right, with that woman. Like, but like the moment you say hi, it's like, oh my God, what the fuck am I even saying? What do I have to say? I have no idea why I'm doing this. Oh my God, how is she going to react, right? Maybe she's gonna say no. That would be the worst thing. Or maybe it would actually be more of a relief. Anyhow, so the ethics of psychoanalysis for Lacan is not only desire, but it's affirming your desire. Why? Because in the end, it's about actually losing that defense of desire. And so what happens is the following. So, okay, let's take Hegel. If you get a PDF of Hegel's Science of Logic or maybe his encyclopedia and you do Control F and you look up the word purity or pure, you'll see that Hegel's absolutely obsessed with this word. Like everything is pure notion, pure ideality, whatever, pure spirit, pure this, pure that. And so the big revolution, the big philosophical revolution of Zizek is to turn this purity into shit. So if you open up the Sublime Object of Ideology, the preface, this book is kind of the book that made Zizek famous back in the day. This book, it starts off with a chapter, the preface is called Hegelian Shitting, and talking about if the idea is constipated, and talking about all of this. So what the hell is, what's happening, right? What's happening here? What's happening here is that this is really the side of where Zizek is reading Hegel in a Lacanian sense. Why? And this is where we enter into Aristotle's theory of the four causes and causality, and especially the final cause. So I've written a paper on Aristotelian causality and also Descartes and Leibniz and Kant and Hegel, but ultimately it's about psychoanalytic causality. Because it's for the Écrit anthology, right? So yeah, like it's such a big topic, and I don't want to talk too long now, but if you actually want to know it, you can read that paper when it's out, or we can talk about it in a personal conversation. But okay, so what happens here is that if you read Lacan on Aristotelian causality, Lacan says that there is, this is my words, a fifth cause. So it's not only, material, formal, efficient, and final cause, but there's a fifth cause. So what is this fifth cause? This fifth cause is the subject itself. So is it the I? Well, yeah, in a way it is, but also not, because it's the split I. It's the split I, right? So where do we see this? We see this in the real of one's desire. So the real of one's desire is not, let's say, the beatific apprehension of what your desire is pointed to, but it's actually maybe the fact that she has a how do you say it? Like a wick, I don't know, my English is failing me, like a weird little brown spot on her face, like something like, or she has maybe weird eyes, or like something weird about her that's not perfect, like it makes her imperfect, right? Or maybe her bodily shape or whatever, maybe she has a quirky laugh. This is actually what keeps you desiring, because this actually makes her in not like an abstract divine beauty. Well, it does, but it's like it also undermines it and subverts it. So this is Lacan picks his cause. Okay, so let me say it like this. So if Lacan is right that there is a fifth cause, then we would have to find this fifth cause in Aristotle himself, right? And Lacan says yes, that's true. And where Lacan picks it out is in a particular term of Aristotle, and this term is tuke or taik. It's like you write it like this, which means chance or contingency in Greek. So this is basically, let's say, the real of the desire of the Aristotelian paradigm for Lacan. So it's actually that chance, that like that type of maybe like sand in the machine, like it brings the machine to a halt, or it brings it is the very glitch, it is the hiccup in causality that keeps desire afloat, that keeps desire going, or actually might backfire and destroy desire, which is where we get to the ethics of the drive. So psychoanalysis, yes, it has an ethics, but it's not a virtue ethics. The one way to read psychoanalysis is really as like Nando does it in his book, like he critiques Althusser, but he also critiques Derrida, not because they're bad thinkers, but because they're great thinkers, right? Like that's what we always should do. When something is great, that's why we should critique it. That's why Marx critiqued Hegel, right? So anyway, so this is, yeah, I mean, maybe we can start here, but yeah, ethics of psychoanalysis is another paradigm. It's an alternative to the Derridian paradigm, so it's an alternative to, let's say, the post-structuralist paradigm. Psychoanalysis is not just another another French theory on discourses. Not that they're anything to scoff at. You know, we can learn so much from them, but um, so yeah, I guess another thing that we can mention here is that so Mladen Dolar is writing a book about the voice. Why? Because in psychoanalysis, once you go into the drive and stuff like this, you come to know that actually there's all kinds of weird partial objects with which are operators of the drive or which keep desire going. And these are just a few examples: the voice, the gaze. Another one would be feces, which I already kind of mentioned, and breasts is another one, right? And here it's not the immediate apprehension of the naked breast. It's actually like that lingerie, you know, when like the top of the lingerie is just falling off her shoulder. It's like these type of moments, right? It's like in that very subtle thing that makes you like, okay, because like it's kind of silly, right? We all know what's beneath it. It's a naked human breast. It's like okay. And another example here is like if you go to a nudist beach, it's not erotic. The bodies there, they're not eroticized, right? It's eroticized when it's like veiled and it's like you can barely see it, or maybe you can see it. Oh no, you can't see it. Like that's the side. So another one, I don't know if we have to add that, but I think it's a good one to also mention. I don't know if Lacan strictly would add that, but I think hands are also there. Like if you look at someone's hands, right? Like hands are kind of an operator of human relationships. Like for example, if you meet up with someone, always we gotta have something in our hands, right? We don't just meet up. That's too awkward. We gotta have like drink a coffee. We gotta shake hands. Like we gotta have all these unsaid and unconscious mediation of the hands. So yeah, these are just some of the things that a psychoanalytic causality and a psychoanalytic ethics is interested in, and the way that it looks at things. Yeah.
That was a magnificent review. And everyone, Dimitri is indeed teaching on Dall-E, and I highly suggest his papers. And we do have the Lacan anthology coming out of Philosophy Portal, and Dimitri's papers are always remarkably written. And so thank you, sir. So a few things come to mind. I think it's very good to bring in contingency, because there is something about contingency of which necessitates particularity and conditionalism, which, as we've talked about before, there's something about Holy Spirit or the Geopadia that is non-fungible. That came up in the discussion. Like algorithm is fungible. You can just carry it around. You can do whatever. It's exchangeable. Whereas, say, this net conversation requires the exact people who are here, who have the ability to speak and hold themselves into account and handle difference and listen to difference and work with difference. This space is not fungible in the sense of you could just pick any random people and bring them together. You would lose that. So there's something radically particular and conditional about the Geopadia, of which then contingency is what follows, because it's contingent that these people are here. It could have been others, right? So there's something about if you get the right conditions with the right people, this can cause something that otherwise could not be caused. So there is something very interesting about the idea. And you could say that what is occurring in this is that there is some sort of realization perhaps of the final cause, or I was talking with Matthew about you're bringing together things in a manner that then glimpse this quality of experience of the beautiful, we might say, that actually then creates an excess of time and other things that Jockin and Javier and Michelle were talking about. And I really do suggest that conversation. So I think it is correct to emphasize contingency. Of course, what contingency also does is mean there's particularity. And when there's particularity, because you're talking about, I think what you were bringing up with partial objects is, of course, the partial object for me is critical for thinking Lacan and Aristotle together. Because when I come to love a particular person, when woman is the definition, and Jockin and I spoke about this as an OG Rose conversation, and I'll give it to Jockin unless Lubri, I can't tell if you still have your hand up from last time or something new, so forgive me. But it's that when you love a particular person, woman becomes Michelle. And so a definition of woman becomes a definitive person of Michelle, and yet weirdly, you know Michelle less than woman. So the movement to particular and definitiveness actually leads to a partial object that then actually creates drive and that creates desire. Because when you know something like Marcise Blondel speaks of, when you have certainty, you don't care about it anymore. That's the weird thing. Like once I know something, I don't care about it anymore, right? You kind of leave it behind. There's this weird way, like when the Bible uses know as a kind of interchangeably with sexuality or knowing, like I knew the wife. It's very interesting how this knowing is actually engagement with a certain mystery, with a certain partiality. So as you move from the definition to the definitive, you actually create mystery or unknown, of which then that condition is precisely of what brings out desire. And then, of course, this desire, but here's the key, and I think you've pointed this out, desire in this context is in an armory. It unarmors you. If you desire Michelle and you want to maintain that, you have to be more vulnerable to Michelle. You have to unarmor. And then if the desire leads to this unarmoring, I think it ultimately has to be supported by a drive to maintain you through the difficulty of that unarmoring. As you go through that vulnerability, if you only have the desire to maintain you, then when you go to the moment the Geopadia is gone, or the beauty is gone, or the real sets in, you'll abandon ship. You'll exit, as Jockin was emphasizing. And I think that's correct. That's completely correct. So desire is cultivated in a condition of which, in particularity, will ultimately create the Geopadia, or love, or drive, or beauty, that then precisely because of how life goes will eventually lead to a challenge, a blow up, and if the virtue is not there, if the commitment is not there, and there's something else beyond just the desire that can fall back onto the drive, then it will probably shatter. And then something we've talked about a lot is it will probably invert into, we've been talking about, Dimitri, how the opposite of beauty is evil, the opposite of good is bad, but actually beauty, when it breaks, as I think it does in this particularity, this definitiveness, it becomes a force of ultra destruction, actually. And that, like, you don't see hatred emerge between strangers. It tends to emerge when there's a deep involvement, right? And so the stakes are very high. The other reason I say all this is because in the definitive object, of which it's contingent that you turn a definition into a definitive object. So the world has to have contingency in it, if you will, for that transition to even occur. Also, if there was not contingency, everything would be the same thing. If there's contingency, it means a thing could be something else. Therefore, contingency is what gives us particularity. And critically, when we experience something as particular, ergo definitive, that for me is when the four causes in this sense become the four causes with the S in parentheses, because you know the thing in the way of the causes that make it itself, that then actually creates a new quality that I think you may associate with the fifth cause that Lacan is getting at, this relation with the partial object that actually is the encounter of the beautiful, of which then means one is at great risk. But you see that movement to the partial object, again, I really, really, really love, thank you, Mr. John, I really love, and I've mentioned it before, and I think you would like it a lot, Dimitri, everyone here would like it. It's a book called The Bridge Over the River Dryma by Avo Andrek. And basically this entire novel centers around a discourse on partial objects and its relation to World War I. And how the partial object actually leads to totalitarianism, totalization, global networks, because there's a failure to recognize that what we want is partial objects. And so every partial object is made full and thus dies. And this actually gradually leads, the book ends with the assassination of Archduke Ferdinand. It's an extraordinary novel that is not appreciated, that perhaps a reason it was not appreciated is because the intellectual resources were not afforded to it that were deserved. I do think it is a novel that warrants great revisiting. But it basically would suggest if we are not able to rightly relate with the partial object, and actually be able to handle it, which I think gets into this question of the virtue ethics that can hold it, then we destroy every partial object, we make it full, which either destroys us or totalizes it, and it more and more moves to a greater and greater scale, and now we have World War I. So the question of us being able to keep things definitive and to hold them in their definitiveness, to keep them as partial objects and to relate them as partial objects and not try. The key image, and I'll stop with this, and then I'll give it to Jockin, is the key image is there's a woman named Fatima, and all the men in town want to sleep with her, of course. She's the most beautiful woman ever. And basically, without giving it away, because this doesn't give too much away, she dies. And some men find her naked body washed up on the river, and they're completely horrified. They don't want to look at it. The image is he's smoking, and he's trying to get the smoke away, like he's trying to get the memory. Well, wait a minute, all the men wanted to sleep, but now you have the naked body, right? What's the problem? And the idea is now that she's dead, there's nothing partial. There's no life, there's no thing in there that the body is actually concealing in the nakedness, and such the naked is now a horror, right? And so this notion that if the veiled is unveiled, and you're forced to see that actually what you want is the unveiling with the UN in parentheses itself, then this becomes a terror, and basically that naked body is a symbolism of the logic that leads to World War I. Like, this is the movement that is actually leading to World War I. And I think I really appreciate the River Over the Durna thinking in that way, and I will pass it on.
Dimitri, I just sent you a text, Dimitri, because I'd love to know that exact text where Lacan's speaking about Chitne, basically Tichne, this fortune. I think that's really surprising, especially as you wrote in your commentary that what Lacan's trying to do is combine the efficient and final causation into one. In physics, Aristotle has a note about fortune, Tichne, what we're talking about, and then spontaneity. And spontaneity is automaton, which, if you go into the etymology of it, it means self-thought, self-desire, self-striving. So basically kind of driving motion. I think that's real. That is, automate, exactly. Oh, he still uses both. Excellent. So no, I would love to see that text, because I think that's actually that caught my attention immediately, that he's if he used one or the other. If he used both, then I have to see where he's using them, because they have very important applications for Aristotle's understanding of causation and motion in the universe and subjects with it. So yeah, I'd appreciate that. I think the other notes in general, I just had that question to Dimitri, so if he just puts it in the chat, that's fine. But I think this is a good example of it, where just to kind of build, I want to just commentate on the larger point of the very fact that I heard this point from Dimitri. I'm not a Lacan scholar. I don't have much insight about him. And now I'm curious by a mention about it, at least from my background. And now I'm now going to go investigate this. So I think it's a good example. Again, if I wasn't on this call, would I be able to do this? No, I wouldn't. So just to draw the commentary away, a Geopadia experience is like, I think that's a way to talk about it. I came in the middle of it, so I know some bourgeois virtue ethics come up. This is actually a very important problem, is that, and actually, as I think in the OG Rose conversation, I talk about this. I'm like on a rampage about it, where virtue ethics can be basically sabotaged and parasitically grabbed onto for any protocol you want, if it actually has indefinite ends that aren't built on some attachment to an ontology of some kind. AKA the video I keep talking about of an educator working with children, like a little elementary school level. And he's talking about the day, and he's going over, okay, kids, we got this. We're trying to get points. They're quantifying their education and all that. And trying to do, because, I remember I had this, like, how many books did you read this semester? That kind of stuff. I imagine, I don't know the particulars, but the point is, they had this measurement, right, and quantification, and they hit a certain number, they're gonna get an ice cream party. And then the instructor, the teacher, goes a slide to remind to show them what numbers they're at right now. And the kids at first just say out loud what the number is. They need a hit, 180. And then when a couple of the other kids go, hey, wait a minute, that number changed. That wasn't the number before. And then the teacher goes, that's right. We rose number. You know why? Because we just got to raise our numbers. Like talk about ideology just like stamped out into these kids, and the kids are confused. They're actually confused. I was so upset for the kids because I remember having ice cream parties when I was a kid. I love that stuff. That was awesome. You know, and you got a little incentive to go do it. And then up the man comes in, and then he's up, just decides just to increase. Nope, we need more productivity out of you. We just need the number to go up. That's it. I mean, that's always the danger of something like virtue ethics. It's very beautiful. Here's a great example. It is beautiful. I think virtue is very beautiful. I think what the accountant talks about gives you a real possibility for how you can shape your life. When that gets captured, big beautiful bill. Yeah, nice. There you go. When it gets captured by different operations, it becomes the most evil things I've ever seen in my life. And very minor thing in the grand scheme of things, after a kid's ice cream party being denied because the number went up. But it's just the fact that it's just in there, and it's just like, it's even the kids who are trying, when the teacher is trying to ask them why the number should go up, and they're like struggling with the reasons. You could feel like they were told the reasons by adults, and they're just trying to kind of meek it out of them. It's not like they're really any strong conviction. You can feel in the room that other kids are like not buying this. And part of my brain part of me is going, those kids who are hesitating, I'm like, yes, hesitate. You should hesitate. That's the truth. Don't buy the ideology. You know, and that's actually one of the big problems is that ideology captures us all. This is also why, personally, my own scholarship, I go on a rampage on eidos versus idea. I don't think they're the same. If you don't have that kind of distinction, you can't make it. You get caught up into saying, oh, when this image corresponds to my desire, everything should be like this. And that's Nazism, fascism, totalitarianism. There is no justification around it. And just one last note, it relates. I was talking to Javier about it because he sent me his discussion with Big Sig. And I think actually very important detail. I think one of the best ways maybe we can bridge a gap between psychoanalysis, Lacanian thought, and virtue ethics is, I keep thinking of, I cannot pronounce his name, the researcher who did flow. Yeah, I can't pronounce it. I'm never going to pronounce that name. But the fact that we know geopedic experiences are real, are documented, and they do exist, I tend to feel like that's one of the ways we can talk about beauty. Oh, yeah, exactly. That name is insane to pronounce. They spell. In the sense of the issue with desire, this relates to Plato in Symposium, where he posits Agathon to have to answer, is the beautiful the good? It's confirmed yes. And they proceed forward with the rest of the dialogue with that assumption. You find out that what love is the desire for the everlasting possession of your desired object. I mean, this fits right into psychoanalysis, Lacanian understanding, from what I understand. It's absolutely true. But the catch with beauty was really interesting about it is that it's kind of an apprehension that you already have. Like, there's two motions. One is the transformation of the self. Like, so it's not going from exteriority to gather it, to get it. It's you change. There's that change. That's different. Positionality is different. But then also a lot of times in beauty, there's witnessing. The quality is not even seeing, it's witnessing. So theoria is one of the most famous examples of this. So the Life of School A with theoria, it's the activity of witnessing. So when you're witnessing, like you're witnessing a sunset, you cannot consume the sunset. You cannot take it into oneself. It doesn't have that operation of consumption. It doesn't work that way. It's an apprehension of witnessing. And that's generally, again, one of these qualities of the beautiful that has. And as Daniel said, and also idea, that's the thing also why the eidos versus idea distinction matters, is because, as Daniel said, the witness beauty is a particularity and a universal at the same time. So when you get captured by ideology, you're really captured by an idea that's usually a secondary substance of some kind, some category, genera of some kind. And you're usually actually violently, and that's the thing I'm getting this from Timaeus, you're violently crushing, you're slamming into one another, the same indifference together to try to fit into an image. So these are just my kind of riffing notes on this point, just to start the conversation on what the connections of Lacanian thought and psychoanalysis and virtue ethics could be. I think that one of the things is that kind of these qualities of beauty that we can talk about in sight. I mean, another note, and this is kind of these are more secondary scholars talking about Plato's discussion about beauty, but that's because Plato is constantly asking this question. It's in 6 dialogues. Is the beautiful the good? It's constantly being asked. When it gets asked so many times, and with every time everyone's saying yes, they're the same. Everyone always answering it's the same. Is that the secondary scholars, one of them I think is very provocative, his answer is that what's going on is that the only way to really, especially things of like double dilemmas of goodness. So meaning like if there's two actually just equally valid good. And I think the example from the Big Sig conversation with Javier was, I forgot the story, I think it was from a story. It was, you can stay with your mother who's sick or go fight the war for glory. Both are good. Which one do you do? The secondary scholar I read for Plato on this question would say, beauty is the only way to answer. You can only adjudicate that in beauty. It's the only way. Because the goods are co-equal, and there's some impositions. Otherwise, you're just picking an imposition about which one it is. There's only through the lens of beauty that's possible. This is not Plato's statement. This is secondary scholar's statement. I'm just presenting this to the group because I think it is an interesting proposition. So I just want to share that with the group. That's all I have. And I'll look in the chat what Dimitri was saying about the citations. I appreciate it.
Well, yes to all of that. So first, one of the reasons why intrinsic motivation is very big to me is because I see in that the possibility of thinking, say, Aristotle and Lacan together, that the topic of intrinsic motivation seems to be critical to this question of bridging these things together, which then gets in Lacan tied to the drive, but there also there's drive on this side of speculative reasoning, on the other, blah, blah, blah. We talked about that last time. I think also it is very interesting to me to think the question of is the good the beautiful that's reoccurring so much in Plato, with also seeing Plato as constantly concerned, as Owen has pointed out, with generational decline, with decline across generations and society, which if those two things go together, then the question of avoiding generational decline is tied to being able to identify if the beautiful and the good are distinct. And I would argue that's probably the case, because I think generational decline is when you find yourself a birdie and donkey between two equally rational choices of the good and you can't make it. Like generational decline, when you can't move generation to generation and maintain the success without falling into decadence, I would argue it is because you end up caught in tragic situations, trade-offs of competing goods, and ultimately you have no heuristic by which to make it, because it is precisely the good, the rational that's caught between. Like this is the absolute truth. Like if you're caught in a situation of two equal-sized piles of grain, as that birdie and donkey example I make all the time as a proof of the necessity of non-rationality, and that is a Nash equilibria, how do you make the decision? What would be the basis of your absolute choice? Well, it can't be the good, and it can't be the rational, because those are equal. It has to be something else, ergo, beauty. It has to be something of which is beyond the immediacy of that choice, that yet nevertheless is latent in the piles. That would lead to one choice versus another. And it would seem to me, if we then tie Plato and the Republic, etc., so forth, to the question of generational decline, how is it that successful parents can keep their kids successful versus start the decline? Because there's this idea, like Owen is stressing, which I really like, and Socrates like, there's this decline going on in that. There's this decline going on. The great success, there's a loss of the war, like things are falling apart. People talk about that in America with the fourth turning. We talked a lot about the fourth turning. And we need to think about Socrates as situated in a fourth turning situation, and that we in the world today are in a fourth turning situation. And it would seem to be that addressing the problem of the fourth turning is tied to the ability to actually maintain a choice between equal goods as a birdie and donkey. And how would you do that without something like beauty by which to make that choice, right? Like the things that get you out of cycles of generational decline in the fourth turning seem to be tied to the ability to make a decision that is beyond just the good, which is not even possible if the good equals the beautiful. There has to be a distinction if there's any hope of avoiding this problem. And if there's reason to think there is, then the questions are, what are the conditions of possibility by which to apprehend that distinct variable, such as the beautiful, of which then if you can do it in a birdie and donkey situation, that if you can't overcome, you have a generational decline, would be precisely in that situation in which that cultivation of that capacity is most important, or else you're stuck and you're now in a fourth turning that only transitions to a first turning to a great leveling event, like a meta crisis or World War III or something like that. So that's a problem. Also, what you were saying about bourgeoisie virtues, I completely agree. The mistake is, yes, there is a certain virtue given by capital. The mistake is the failure to realize that using capital as a means habituates you, because it is a medium and a sociology, to then treating it as the end. Like if you literally could keep the algorithm as a means to Geopadia, to intrinsic motivation, that'd be fine. But this is why capitalism or economics need a theory of architecture and sociology, where being in a space of where you're using this changes your orientation. You can't use a tool without it also changing you. And that then means you have to make additional efforts to just the economic system to make sure that capital doesn't become an end, which it naturally will if you're not creating, say, geopedic spaces to make sure that people don't fall into that mistake. Like, let's put it this way, and Mr. Kashir, good to see you, sir. If you use the algorithm, it is likely for you to basically treat the algorithm as an end in itself. Another formula, every phenomenon brings with it a tendency to treat it as the end. Like if you use it enough, everything has the potential of becoming the end, right? And so the issue is the algorithm, quote unquote, today is the most successful good, if you will. It is so successful, it is so efficient that it makes sense that it would be the dominant thing that people are employing, whether it be online or in their own systems protocol, the algorithm, algebra in general. Because that is the most prevalent thing that people are using, it thus makes sense that it would be that of which is most likely to become the end of all things because of that very good of it, right? And that's when you get in trouble, is when a thing that you use stops being a means and becomes an end, and then now it's, by definition, it's enclosed. Like, what is an enclosure? We keep saying that enclosure is problematic, right? An enclosure is when the means are also the ends. The means equal the end. There is no meaningful distinction between means and ends. Like if you want diversity and creativity and different, the geometry requires a meaningful distinction between means and ends, okay? If there is no meaningful distinction between means and ends, you're dealing with an algorithm. You're dealing with an equal sign, right? Versus an equivalence. You're dealing with a blob versus a relation, right? And the problem is that every means can, through enough time, become equivalent to the end of which you're using that means. And now you have an enclosure because the means equal the end, right? And so making sure that the means do not become the end is the constant battle, the constant work. And that's where things like the virtue, et cetera, so forth seems important. I will stop there and give it to Mr. Luber, Dimitri, and then Sam Willem. Mr. Luber, please.
Daniel, real quick, because I'm forgetting exactly. You were talking about Lacan, Dasting, Heidegger. I have something to say to that, but I just want to double check with what you were saying.
What Mr. Boothby suggests is that Dasting, Lacan was extremely excited about the concept of Dasting and saw it as basically like a yes, this is going to kind of almost, maybe this language is not correct, but this is going to take psychoanalysis to the next level, dang it. This is kind of a piece that was really needed. And then Lacan moves beyond, and he doesn't really mention it anymore. The next generation update is going to be the PlayStation 6. And, he kind of leaves it behind. And Boothby is like, why? Why did he do that? And Boothby is like, this is a really generative concept that we could think about religion through and think about, he really wants to think ritual and religion as around like the dusting as a space of the sacred. But Lacan leaves it behind, and Boothby posits that a reason that may be is because dusting could be associated with something like being in a Heideggerian sense, and Lacan wants to distance himself from Heidegger because of Nazi associations. Whether that is right or wrong, that is the possibility. That's a possible explanation of why dusting.
Gotcha. Okay. So real quick, it's not necessarily that he doesn't, the fear of, from a psychoanalytic perspective, of creating an ontology. So
no,
it's not like,
and in fact, you can read a book like Not To that's actually quite a good book by Savant. It's the Not To. I think Siggs has, yes, Chesa. And Big Sig, I believe, has had a discussion with him that I have not heard because I'm a terrible human being. But I've really enjoyed that book, which is constantly asking the question: can we make, or should we make, and what is the dangers of thinking an ontology with psychoanalysis? Which I think. One could argue if Lacan was open to that, if he was entirely against that. I'm not 100% sure, but Boothby, let's put it this way. Boothby himself is claiming that moving away from dusting is not because Lacan was afraid of an ontology or something. Maybe elsewhere Lacan is, but it would not for Boothby be in this instance.
Gotcha. Yeah, I don't know. my speculation is when you talk about a constant, you're basically you're ontologizing something, because that's essentially what a constant is an ontology. It's in that realm. And definitely, you know, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think basically when you establish some ontology, it begs for an ethic. That's like part of my speculation of, oh, if I just stay in between this space where I don't basically I don't actually advocate any extreme, because if I advocate an extreme, it's either perverted, hysteric, or neurotic of some nature. So I want to stay within those bounds. And then it's hard to really create or have an understanding of the ethic of what's, you know, taking what's wrong, just like an ethical position, perhaps. I don't know. That's a speculation I wanted to throw out there, but I think what's really amazing, the Geopadia, just what the sentiment there is doing is it's really creating the stakes very clear of our time. And basically, that's not to say that we're going to get rid of the algorithmic mindset like you noted, but it does seem like we're in this position where it's either this or that. And it seems like it's going to be hard to articulate. Like, I'm curious how basically the algorithm side would sublate properly insofar as it has an appropriate relationship with the Geopadia side of the stakes here. So that's just like a question that I kind of want to throw out to the group, because it's not clear I get the move, and I think it's like a necessary move, but this is all building up toward that event horizon where we can't see past, kind of thing. Yeah.
Honestly, for me, this is where like the solo residual MIT economics that points out that when you account for growth, liquidity, you have 35 to 50% of economic growth that you cannot explain, which is one of the great mystery of economics. Basically, I would argue, you know, we call it rhetoric in the book. So discourse and rhetoric, you know, discourse, algebra, algorithmic. You know, the rhetoric is going to be the voicecraft or Geopadia, like Padia. I keep wanting to put the E instead of the A, and it keeps flipping in my head. But it's Padia, play. Basically, the Geopadia has throughout history, without a name, been what has afforded that 50% of unexplained economic activity of the solar residual. And I think that is very fair, because you can only explain that residual by bursts of creativity, social networks, interactions, strong institutions, and things outside of economics that make the possibility of economics. And I like what Dimitri was saying in the comments about a way psychoanalysis kind of focusing on that which is outside that makes ontology possible. So like it is focused on, you could say like psychoanalysis in that sense is interested in the territory outside the map that can only be thought from the map, and yet that map itself would be getting in the way of thinking the territory that is outside of it, if I use that sort of language. So then you have to think assuming the inability of making a map territory distinction. That's actually a really important kind of idea, and the Map is Indestructible book has to talk about this through Alfred Korbowski, is that ultimately if the map is not the territory, that's useless unless you have like a first-person God perspective to tell. Like, you have to know the map is not the territory in the map. Oh, and by the way, the territory consists of the ability to generate maps. Oh, okay. And actually, maps are part of the territory. So the distinction actually opens up having to think an entirely new way to think. It's actually not going to be enough simply to say, oh, the map's not the territory, so we just got to figure out where the map is, get rid of it, and get to the territory. No, that's called the real, and you get destroyed. You can't do that. So the idea that the map is not the territory simply says you have trouble on your hands, and you've got to think through what to do with that. And it actually, in my opinion, to be pretty radical, destroys all categories of epistemology, but that was gigantuous. But Mr. Luba, did you have more to say? Because
okay, I guess one more question is, I guess to go right at the jugular here, it's very confusing to me how this will be into the future of religion, because basically there's all these different theological takes, and it seems like everything that is being suggested points to a theological position, and it seems like there can't be, like, part of the necessity here is that there can't be like one theological position. Like, there can't be a universal theological position. There has to be like the ability to hold different theological positions without basically diminishing others. But like, I don't see how that's necessarily a possibility based off of what a theological position entails, which is that, you know, this is the right and only way. So I just kind of, I have thoughts, but I honestly rather hear what everyone else has to say about this stuff. I'll just say one. To me, this is all like the story theme shit can really help with something like that. Just because the positive command that comes out of basically the fact that there is no big other, then basically your faith toward that positive command, which would just be the theme of some sort, would basically then allow you to be like, yeah, okay, like I'm operating under that positive command and the other person's operating under that positive command, but it's still respecting the fact that there's a lack and that the big other essentially is lacking more than us. And like that almost in a certain sense is like the universal theological position that God, or just that God dimension, is essentially lacking more than how we are lacking. And like that position to me seems like the only tentative like proposition that could appropriately be a universal one. But okay, that was just like a quick little gist. I have more to say, but I really want to hear what y'all have to say.
I love quick little gist with like ultra questions. That's just a little thing. I'll drop it here, and you know, the ultra questions. So that's really beautiful. Yes. And then the question is, even if you afford, let's say you achieve that state, how do you make it plausible to people that it is not self-delusion or just convenience? Well, there would have to be mystery, strike of beauty, Geopadia. What would be the quality of which would give you reason to think that taking that very stance is not just an arbitrary decision for the sake of convenience and dealing with a... Because it could be the case that the nature of reality is that which the right position is that of which doesn't afford community and political possibilities. Why couldn't it be that actually the correct position is that of which is self-destructive, right? Well, you would need a metaphysics, theology, and all of that to have reason to think that. And you would have to have a quality of experience that would give you reason to think that this would help you overcome the birdie and donkey problem, because all of these accounts could be good relative to their internal... This is the problem of internal consistency versus correspondence. You could have that account you just gave, Mr. Luber, could be internally consistent with an account that doesn't do that and is more exclusionary. You could have, what I put in the chat is, you're pointing to, and then I'll give it to Dimitri, Sam, and Javier, what you're pointing to is the need for a costly perennialism from a concrete standpoint, which of course sounds like a contradiction because a concrete standpoint will have a certain exclusivity from it, and yet that exclusivity has to somehow be an open exclusivity, which makes no sense at all. How is it even possible to do that in a manner that doesn't just sound convenient and wistful? wishing for that to be a viable option so that the world doesn't eat itself. Well, you would need a quality of experience that would give you reason to think that it is valid. Well, you're not going to get that from the good. This is, for me, the absolute choice. You can't get that from the good because every internally consistent map is equally good in its consistency. So if it is only coherence by which you determine it, you're done. You have to have a variable of correspondence, but correspondence is what coherence keeps you from getting, because the map is why you can't get the territory, and if you did, it would be the real that would destroy you. So you need to get an experience of the correspondence, or that of which gives you reason to think it is more like correspondence than not, that is cannot be given by the good, because the good is always defined by coherence, and that by definition will be a strike of beauty, a glimmer, a glimpse, that of which comes forth under certain conditions of which are isomorphically possible in every possible map beyond the coherence, a condition that is non-fungible of which affords a certain experience that give you reason to believe that a costly perennialism from a concrete standpoint is a valid position to take, because it is not simply in questions of the good, but a certain quality of experience by which it is afforded. So that's where the Geopadia, in my Padia, the Holy Spirit, as Zizek said, the flow, etc., so forth. That's why that experience, but it has to be flow in a communal. Otherwise, you get a dark side of flow where it's egoic. You have to be talking intrinsic motivation that maintains the social, therefore virtue, etc., so forth. That is so critical, because otherwise you're simply stuck with the problem of indestructible maps and having to judge according to coherence. And you can never, ever, ever, ever overcome the birdie and donkey problem from that. You need something distinct for the absolute choice, and that is going to lead to beauty. And then creating the conditions of possibility in architecture, et cetera, so forth, for that to occur. Everything you said was really important. I will give it to Dimitri, Sam, and then Javier. Dimitri, please.
Sorry, I have to breathe like 2-3 times before I talk, because I'm still incorporating your speech, you know. Yeah, it's a good practice to go a bit slower. Okay, so so the title of the paper that I'm going to bring out of this whole Lacanian causality thing is the title of my paper is "What Doesn't Work." What doesn't work, but the problem, because philosophers only have problems all the time. The problem is that what doesn't work is still operative. And this is Lacanian causality. This is Lacanian causality. So, Jockin, I appreciate that you mentioned the automaton, because there is a difference between the two. We can't just equate them. So the way that Lacan understands it, and I know there's been different readings of it. Sometimes Lacanian readings are very boring. You know, it's like, yeah, I understand why some people have are repulsed by Lacan, because they read or know a few supposed Lacanians, and they're like, what? But this is just another French discourse joke. Anyway, so but there's more there. There's more there. I think so. And so what is the difference? I call it 2K, that's how I pronounce it. So 2K is, for Lacan, you can see it as the gap in the automaton. So between one occurrence and the next occurrence, let's say between A and B and C and D and E, F, G, between all these, there is a gap, right? And in this gap, for Lacan, a little bit of the real is produced, which is unsymbolizable. Which is unsymbolizable, and there's a contingency dwelling in that gap. So another way to see this is that, which I'm generally very fascinated by how causality was taken up in the entire history of philosophy, because what do we see? And that's also like really what my paper was about. It wasn't just about Lacanian causality, but really the history of how causality was conceptualized in philosophy, and then how we can relate that, how there was this retroactively there we can see a certain kind of development to Lacan, and actually it was Kant who was the big turning point here. But so okay, Aristotle, 4 causes. Why? Why was there 4 causes? Well, the final cause was, of course, about the telos, or it's about theology, right? So it's the final goal, it's the end, it's not just the means. And all causes are basically inhering in the final cause. So what's radical about this? Don't we all know this? Well, the radical thing, and this was really Aristotle's point, from what I'm seeing, is that for Aristotle, it's not just that humans have a telos, but nature itself is imbued with an end. Nature itself, and this is a very strange point to make. It's a very weird point to make. We can critique it, but whatever. And that's what it happened with Descartes and with Spinoza, especially. You can see that they were saying, so Descartes was saying, philosophy shouldn't comport itself with the final cause. That's just up for like religion and theology. What philosophy can do, it can understand the efficient causality, or the relations of cause and effect, without having a telos in mind. And it's not that there is no final cause, but like if you want to, like, I mean, it's a bit simple, but like there was some kind of mechanistic worldview in Descartes, right? Rationalism. So Spinoza completely took that up and was like, okay, that's fine, but there is the beauty of the efficient cause itself. So what Spinoza does is he collapses the final cause into the efficient cause. So you don't have to add anything to, let's say, mechanistic operativeness, but it itself is blessing. It is also the necessity to which one can align, which is liberation. That's freedom for Spinoza. And so once we get to Hegel, no. Okay, let's not go to Hegel, actually. Fuck that. Once we get to Leibniz, we get something interesting, because Leibniz is like, yeah, okay, that's nice, but we shouldn't rule out the final cause. Actually, they are in a pre-established harmony, right? All substances are in a pre-established harmony with each other. And so there is two realms. Yes, there is the realm of the body, there is the realm of the soul, and there are also like the realm of efficient and final causality, but they're harmonious, right? They're like in a big ice cream twirl. They don't contradict each other. They are beautiful. But so Kant, the big break here was really Kant. And I mean, you can make the argument that Hegel radicalized it, but you can also make the argument that Hegel kind of stepped back from it. And that's also, like, that's an argument that Alenka Supancic has been making, which is really fantastic. And we shouldn't forget that in the forward steps in philosophy, sometimes we make a step back if we just think like a student or someone who comes after and is responding to the predecessor is better, right? We shouldn't assume that. We don't have any guarantees. So with Kant, we get the idea of transcendental freedom. And transcendental freedom for Kant is, oh man, I mean, I don't want to talk too long, so I don't want to completely go into this, but transcendental freedom for Kant is actually constituted in the gap of causality. So for Kant, it's not okay. So for Kant, we live in a deterministic universe. Yes, Leibniz, Spinoza, you guys were basically right. Also, I mean, they were kind of extracting that from from Descartes. For Kant, they were basically right, yes. But this deterministic universe is, and here we can go into the woman question, is like not all. It's not fully encapsulated in the sense that there is it's a free decision that grounds the determinism, which is a blatant contradiction. And if you would like to point that out, well, you are knocking on an open door, because this is the Kantian transcendental turn, and everything starts shifting here and becoming crazy. Anyway, I mean, I'm really obsessed with this type. Especially a few months ago, I was obsessed with it. Now I'm moving on to different topics. But yeah, my paper is really about all of this. I go deep into it there. But one more thing. So Daniel, I really appreciate that you give the example of particularity. But there is a strange thing here with psychoanalysis, very strange, because if and Radon Dollar really goes into that, like, yes, the voice is so beautiful. It can be so angelic. We are totally captivated by it, mesmerized, maybe even petrified, right? If it's too much with the whole Beatrice thing that you like to talk about. So, but the particularity of the partial object, for psychoanalysis, it's not the final point. Actually, it is something that we could call the that which doesn't work as an operator, which brings you to the lack in the other. And this is actually like basically the singularity of self-related negativity. Oh, Luber's left. Okay, well, that's a bit of a shame, but I like that he went into like the multiplicity of theologies and how do you choose and stuff like this, because I think for like psychoanalysis and also Hegel, they are really choosing singularity over multiplicity. But it's not just, it's like, it's like a singularity of Parmenides, right? It's a very, very radical singularity. It's not just like, oh, it's a one, or it's not just a blatant, like a simple assertion of the one. Uh, anyway, so what's really crazy to me with Lacan that I've been hurting my mind about for still all these years is there's the logic of the all and the exception, and then the logic of the non-all without exception. And this, how does Lacan explain this with the graphs of sexuation? So the logic of the all and its exception would be like this. It would be the idea that let's say capital is subsuming the globe and subsuming production of the globe, subsuming humans, subsuming nature, right, into its valorization process. But the logic of exception to the all would say we can constitute an exception to this all-engulfing movement. We can be what's those Americans call it? We can be the Amish, or we can be like a working class movement and take up working class identity. But what we're basically seeing now is that, especially for subjects like us who are produced by capital, is that we can't constitute an exception to capital. It's quite ridiculous, actually, if you try to assert working class identity. It is, in other words, an assertion of capital itself. So capital has totalized, but by having done this totalization, basically it has fallen into this great imbalance. And okay, so let me be concrete, because I think this is very abstract. But an example would be the massive investments that are being done in education. Because take, for example, business. There are so many business leadership coach type of stuff that says, yeah, you're going to be productive if you just take this course. You can start a company if econometrics and stuff. But we, like, from statistics, empirical statistics, we know that business studies really are not good at like making good business people. So that's like, isn't that hilarious? It's like the thing that should be the most productive, and productivity always means being productive for capital, in my view, honestly. But like that thing is like, it is not productive at all, and we shouldn't lament that. It's like, yeah, it's great that there's universities and that people do like supposedly useless things like art and culture, right? So yeah, the conversation about like this fetish of productivity or fetish of usefulness um, should really be like avoided. And I think, there's merit to uselessness, but there's also merit to, avoiding the blackmail. It's like we don't have to be useful or useless. Like we can be in a space that we can just be in the space of indecision, right? And isn't this the kenotic drive? Isn't this like Christianity and psychoanalysis, right? Like it's a kind of a refusal of a blackmail, and that is the crucifixion, right? That is self-related negativity. That is like coming to a truth which you struggle to speak because you don't even know what you're saying. You don't even know that if you would know that what you were saying, that the other would understand it. And that's fragile, right? Because it's a space between being quiet and eloquence. It's like you're not quiet, but you're also not eloquent. And that's like garbled up speech insecurity. And that's really the space of transformation. And really, I think that's what psychoanalysis is about to me, as a theory. That's one of the ways we can look at it, anyhow.
Magnificent. And I'll give it to Sam, Javier, and Mr. Jockin. And this evening I will have chairs to do, but not at this moment. I'll probably just send Haven to do it. It's good for him. He can be productive and he'll be good on his resume, and, we'll, outsource it. But, it's very funny because what you were saying, there's this irony that I think about a lot, in which you cannot, what has happened is I think there has been a realization that investing to make people productive is never as effective as if you can convince people to ground their identity in being productive. And the same way that no matter how much you spend on schools, it will never be as good as the school where kids' identity is tied with getting straight A's, right? So what this does is actually create an incentive of if you can get people to internalize the logic of capital or the algorithm or productivity, that's what you want to do. And you see, because that's always going to be the return on investment. But of course, that's where everything has become that's where with the Geopadia, that means the algorithm wants us to live our lives like algorithms. That's where now cloud capital, you could say the viciousness of cloud capital is it has seemingly effectively figured out how to actually get a successful return on investment by changing how we identify ourselves. Until cloud capital, it really wasn't as good at it. Now, so you couldn't like successfully get a return on productivity investments. Now they have found a way through the algorithm, et cetera, so forth, to fairly effectively make people identify with being productive. And that's now when you're getting a return on the investment. But in all these areas where the investment in the very thing that it doesn't do it, like you invest to make productivity and you just create all these jobs that are BS jobs, as Geber and different people talk about. What's very, like if I were to say the idea that you're in a new phase of capital, like Varoufakis, or we'll talk about techno-feudalism, I think there are some critiques you can make of that. But if you were to say, is there evidence of a qualitative change between the way that markets work today versus when Dietrich McCloskey or whoever is talking about the great enrichment, it would be actually now the effectiveness of means to train behavior and thus to make people identify with productivity or with consuming, that's like a code has been cracked, right? And that's a qualitative difference that necessitates Geopadia in spaces like this and the beautiful and all the stuff that we were talking about is now the forces of making people internalize a certain logic are very, very strong. Now, it's also not totalitarian, though, which if it was, you could say it would be easier. Like if there was a dictator saying you must believe X, Y, and Z, that's actually would be like if our problem was literally a big brother, we'd almost be in a better state because you could target it. But our problem is that it's Kafka. It's the very zeitgeist of the age that is making us go toward our trial. That's making us go toward the castle. That's why identifying the problem now as Kafka versus Huxley and Orwell is very big for me, mixed in with a little bit of the movie Brazil, because I think that's very, very good. So I think that point is very important. Dall-E, I think, is one of what I would just say quickly and then give it to Sam, is that what you were saying, yes, absolutely, that there's another step from the particular. There is an identification of the lack in the other, and that is actually the test to see if you can move to the definitive. So I think in the talk with Jockin, we talked about general, particular, definitive, where general is a woman, the particular is that woman, and the definitive is Michelle. And ultimately you have to get to Michelle, but that requires an encounter of lack. But that lack is the necessary condition of a distinction between the particular and the definitive, which you have to get to the particular first. But that is where beauty then depends, as Jockin we've talked about, on surprise, forgiveness, holding negativity, being able to see through virtue. Like you're not going to make that transition unless you're able to hold and encounter that lack and actually work it into the relation. And that's where then the beauty, like it's very hard to imagine beauty without facing that reality of the imperfect, facing that negativity. And so I completely agree. And there is something about the voice that is incredibly tied to that. And actually a reason I think it is because every word that is said can't be unsaid. I always think, on this idea that you're getting at within, like you freely choose the determination and everything goes crazy at that point. I think the voice perfectly captured this because everything that is said cannot be unsaid. It is freely said and then it's instantly determination. And so much of our challenge today is learning to speak. So much of our new Geopadia is in speaking and learning to speak, because speaking is the ultimate middle ground between freedom and determination, that we are structuring live a determined, like as we're doing the net, we are creating a determined structure of the words that are said. That is now absolute. These words were said and it has a structure to it. It is not flimsy. Like everything that is said cannot be unsaid. So you're actively creating determination as you speak. And that is simultaneously bringing the map and the territory problem out because the words are not the territory, and yet they are creating the map by which the territory is known that you can never get to. And there is a certain nervousness in the act of speaking that makes it psychoanalytical. And there is something about speaking that creates the conditions necessary for the Geopadia, right? And so speaking, I think, is very wise to identify. And this also hints at why, and we've said it before, speaking, writing, reading seem to be so central to the formation of subjectivity because those acts are dealing with language, and there's something about language that is the freedom determination problem, and it is uniquely forming the subject, and that's why I then belong again. I do think history shows explosions of speech correlate with these great enrichment periods, et cetera, so forth. I will stop there and then give it to Miss Sam Willem. Miss Willem, it is good to see you today, and we are going to have you down at the house. I'm glad we talked about it. We're going to make it happen. Great. Sam.
Hi. Yeah, I don't know where this conversation started because I was a little late. So if this is way far afield, let me know. But yeah, just kind of reflecting on what you guys have said lately. I thought that what I was reading lately was very pertinent to the conversation, and I've been working my way through Ivan Illich's text Gender. And yeah, why I thought it was interesting. Initially, I thought about it, Daniel, when you had talked about enclosure needing to be resisted in favor of relation, and obviously, like the relation between the genders is like central to the text. And then further on, when Dimitri, you were talking about capital and the like self-exploitation of like productive living, I found it really interesting because when I began reading the text, I did not anticipate this being a major like cornerstone of his idea, but the thought is that scarcity actually like suppresses gender in people, and that like in order to have an economic system based on scarcity, which like current global capitalistic systems are, yeah, you have to like suppress gender in people. And that actually this like idea of the of self-exploitation and productive living, it depends on a sort of like fourth gender. Like if you have male, you have female, you have the hermaphroditic, and then, or like sometimes maybe like the both gender that you see like exemplified by the Corinthian columns and children, youth. So that would be the third. And then the fourth, I think, and we often don't think about this, but I thought that Illich was really astute in noticing this, that in that self-exploitation, you get the arising of the neutered or the castrated gender. It's not both genders, it's neither. So if like, it's really funny because he starts looking at the at sexism as directed towards women and at feminist movements during the 70s, and then he arrives at the conclusion that feminism is actually sexism because it leads like, it's like instead of like creating a way in which both of the sexes in their gendered and in their genderness are like of equal value, it actually just like tries to again suppress gender in them and turn both male and female into a neutered gender. But yeah, I thought this was interesting in terms of like enclosure relation, because as I was reading through this text, I really thought like, and he distinguishes between sex and gender. So I really understand it as like, you've got your biology, you have your animal nature that has a sex. You can, this is obviously a canceled text. And then on top of that, we are human. So we have the symbolic, the mental realm of human life, and we have culture, we have cultural evolution that builds on top of biological evolution. And I think he, like, kind of in my own framework, I see gender as operant in that like symbolic realm. And he says, which is really interesting, that like the only way to usefully talk about gender is through metaphor, that if you try and speak about it in explicit terms, it will always like evade description. He also talks about various vernacular cultures having different engenderments from like one village to the next, and then it starts to make things like gendered language. And when I was learning French, you have like every word is gendered, and it starts to make sense because he talks about vernacular cultures having every tool is gendered. Like if in your village only men use axes, then you shouldn't, then that's like, if only men are using axes, then the word axe should be gendered such. Interestingly, though, you might have a village down the street that, not down the street, but, you know, relatively close and within the same language, where axe is actually only used by women. Yeah, so, you know, there would have been this point with industrialization as globalization, with like empire, travel, all these things where languages would have been sort of flattened out, and all of those male, female, masculine, feminines would have been standardized, and then you needed dictionaries so that you could, you know, the community that used to call axes feminine now has to call them masculine, and so on. But yeah, but I thought this was really great because it kind of takes the world as we know it and it just bifurcates it. I thought a little bit actually of like the gospel according to Mary Magdalene. There's like a part in there where it's like darkness is the first force and the second force is desire. And again, I think that speaks to what we were getting at way earlier in the conversation, which is beauty, goodness. This engendering of the world, it preserves difference. It rather, you know, wherein relation can occur. And then, you know, I thought this, so if we take that as the framework for like what is beauty, it's like, okay, well, often we're trying to like make both the good and the beautiful something independent, something universal. I mean, maybe that's really inherently what Plato is trying to do with like an ideal realm of forms. But I really like this thought that it's like, okay, like as not as like women and men, not as these women and these men, but as like Sam and Daniel and Thomas, like at that level of the definitive, it's like we're all participatory in this cultural realm, in this engendered space, to like stretching apart differences between all of us. And in that space that we create between us with those differences, then you get like possibility for desire, for relation. And it's like in that space that beauty can spark. And I like it because it preserves the subjectivity of the beautiful, and doesn't try and make it independent and universal. And it makes our subjectivities, as we cultivate them, participatory to the shape of that space wherein beauty can spark. And so this like cultivation of difference, this cultivation of difference, whether we do that like through the engenderment of the world or by other means maybe, but that cultivation of difference, it's just like so critical to respecting that definitive level. And I thought that's interesting too, because he talks about how like the human being, which is the sort of primary figure in anything, you know, like if we have a treatise on human rights, we refer to the human. We don't, you know, and like obviously like, you know, I think of myself as a human being. So I'm not like trying to say that that's a bad thing, but or that one shouldn't, but it is an abstraction, like the human without sex or without engenderment, whether you combine or decouple those two things, the human without those are abstract. And Yeah, so I think that sort of like ties in. It's like it's kind of like a nesting doll. It's like there's different ways to cultivate difference, and there's different ways to like to create enclosures of sameness. And then the human is one of those enclosures that we've chose to create. And I think it's a great enclosure. Like I would definitely, like same with equality. Like I think there's a way in which that enclosure can really work for us, obviously, like so long as we keep it costly, as you were saying, like as opposed to the cheap. So long as there's skin in the game, I think is kind of what, you know, that would imply.
Oh, complete absolute friggin' fire. I adore Ivan Illich. And basically, to say something general, Ivan Illich is perhaps, there may not be a better collection of case studies or history of the movement from the geopadic to algebra to the systematic from the human. Is Ivan Illich. You could say that an issue of Ivan Illich is a way I've described him is as a core thinker. He doesn't have a giant text, but he has a bunch of these little texts that seem unrelated. But actually, like a lava core is coming on different planets and it seems unrelated. There's actually an overarching thinking in Ivan Illich through all of this, right? He's talking about gender, the movement. He has a wonderful book on H2O and the waters of forgetfulness. He talks about the disablement, right to useful unemployment. Shadow work is an incredibly important book. We could go on. All of these are basically the movement of human being to the algebraic. You know, movement into the algebraic, or disablement is another term. Disablement is very, very important for Mr. Illich. On the last thing you said about human rights, well, Simone Weil basically came out and said he was against human rights because we offloaded the work of cultivating attention to human rights. And she thought that human rights was a way of like convincing ourselves that we attended to our fellow man without doing the work of being able to actually encounter them. And so she was critical. People like, oh, are you like anti-human rights? He's like, the problem is human rights is an abstraction that removes the work of attention and therefore feeds the probability of what he called affliction, which is enclosure. So you're exactly right on what you're saying. And Mr. Illich, well, Mr. Illich also basically, to exactly everything you were saying so well, Illich saw the transformation of the home to basically an apartment, that it was no longer a space that was cultivated. And basically he's suggesting that the reality of difference but in gender, you know, sex, differences in sex are very obvious at the home, right? When you're working the home or when you're in a particular community or space, like it's very clear these things are not fungible. So capital, and he was a big fan of Carl Planier and the idea that markets are made. They don't just arise rationally from a state of nature, that they are created. And Carl Planier in The Great Transformation makes this argument about how basically when capital markets started, people had to be forced off the foreign land. It was not something where people rationally decided capitalism is the best way to do it. They actually had to be basically forced to participate in the Industrial Revolution. Now, Dietrich McCloskey, though, does not like Carl Planier, so this is a live debate. But, you know, and I like Dietrich McCloskey, but I think Carl Planier has great points, so that's a fun contradiction to work on. But Ivan Illich believes that everything in the game is to get people basically away from the home. And because the further from the home we get, the more difference seems fungible. The more you can create non-sex. You can create not like man and women, there's this non-gender, right? Or you can also critically, if people don't have skills, they rely on the expert class so they can't take care of themselves, right? So he also is extremely critical of development programs in third world nations that he say are actually defining progress as disablement. The more disabled you are and the more dependent you are on technology, we define progress as increasing dependency on experts and losing subsistence. The term he uses is subsistence. Well, so Illich is saying this: the further you get away from subsistence, the more plausible it becomes to you that the algebraic is actual versus the geometric. Therefore, male and female are the same. Therefore, there's kind of a fungibility to life. And that when you actually can sustain the majority of your life in a particular home, in a particular place, difference is more real to you. Difference is more real to you. When you go to the workplace, when you're leaving all the time or going out, you would think that would make difference more real to you, right? You're seeing different kinds of people. You're seeing different cultures. He's arguing, no. It is actually only in the roots, as Simone Weil would say, in an embedded common life, basically, to use Hume's language. That's when difference comes out. You do not experience difference as a tourist, is basically the idea. Like if you're always just going out and traveling or whatever, you're not actually experiencing difference. You're just a tourist. And actually, there's a French philosopher, I can't remember his name, he says, we're now the age of barbarians. We just go to different countries, get cool experiences, and go back home. We're kind of barbarians, just going and pillaging and getting what we want from other cultures and people and leaving, right? So Mr. Illich is basically suggesting in a society that lacks subsistence, it is more likely everything becomes fungible. And I think it's basically just what you were so beautifully articulating, is that when the home is a home, per se, when the community is a community versus the home be an apartment, basically. Most people's homes are actually just apartment. It's where they sleep between work days. It's not actually a space that they're cultivating, right? And so it goes with community, so it goes with restaurants. Everything is something you are passing through, if you will, to the end of make the number go up, make the number go up. So everything is about make the number go up. And so there are no homes. Home is where subjectivity is participatory. And that's where then beauty strikes. The more you are in a subsistence area, the more you are, which would mean handle difference, handle surprise, forgive, hold virtue. Like the more, let's put it this way, the more you can move from disablement to enablement, the more you can hold a space, the more you can be subsistence, the more subjectivity is going to necessarily be participatory. Just like you were saying, Sam, in a beautiful way. That is when beauty strikes and you get the definitive. That you then get this sort of bringing together of all of these factors in a manner that is the Geopadia. I'll give it to Javier and then Mr. Jockin. But I think Ivan Illich is insanely important. And also it would be fascinating because supposedly Ivan Illich's unfinished program that is alluded to in an interview book he did called The Rivers Out of the North, I think, is where he wants to argue that we can understand all of this relative to the birth of the idea of contingency in the West. And I think that's relative to things that were said earlier. It's like he doesn't think there had ever been a history of the idea of contingency. And that this is all tied to this in very odd and unique ways, but it's what Mr. Illich was trying to lay out as kind of his key argument for the formation of the modern world. And for him, the modern world is where the best of things became the worst of things. So that's a kind of inverse. We've been talking about that. He has this idea that Christianity, when Christianity inverts in the West through modernity, it becomes the worst of things, right? Because the more serious the things you're dealing with, if you're dealing with the beautiful, then it can become the evil. Mr. Illich does not use that language, but he is certainly believing that something had occurred where very good things were becoming very bad things. And basically, we could say that algorithm got rid of Geopadia. I think Mr. Illich, that's basically what he's saying, that the algebraic, the system, got rid of the human, that we moved. And of course, his other very important book is Tools of Conviviality, where he makes the distinction between technology of manipulation and technology of conviviality. But this is all to say, Ivan Illich is great, and what you shared was fantastic, and I will give it to Javier and then Mr. Jockin. Javier Rivera.
All right, yeah, this was good. I think about halfway in of like raising my hand and listening, I was like, oh yeah, I got nothing to say now. uh, so this was something that I threw at the wall with Jockin, but I'm gonna throw it here because I've been reading Aquinas. I really do see the conflation of goodness and beauty. And it's interesting because in Aquinas, question 5, the first part of the Summa, you can just tell Aquinas is stuffing so much in this part of goodness. And for him, it's like it starts off with being and goodness are the same, but they differ in idea. Being is captured first intellectually, which I thought was interesting. But goodness is first because it's actually has to do with the final cause. So that means it's actually the first of all causes. So it has to do with motivation. That's why I kind of jotted down. But then Aquinas makes this other distinction with what makes goodness and being different? It's like, well, it's desire. But then there's another element called perfection. Everything good is what we desire, but then we also desire for our own perfection. And then I thought perfection was a really interesting compression into this concept of goodness. Because I feel like when we talk about beauty, perfection feels like that's what beauty is. Perfection, proportion, symmetry, the four causes lining up together. So Aquinas then goes into this idea of primal actuality, which I thought was interesting. And I thought, is it possible that beauty moves lack into a different position? And so what does that mean? And Aquinas talks about primal actuality. So primal actuality is because goodness and being are basically the same, but in primal actuality, being is just being simply, and the good is relative because it is only because of this kind of being, potential and actuality. So that means everything has relative perfection and relative goodness, but nothing is simply good. But then we move into this other concept called complete actuality, and complete. Hold on.
Oh,
Jockin,
Dimitri's got to go. Jockin had a question. Although everything you say is great.
Go ahead.
Throw it at him. Throw it at him, Jockin.
Okay, thank you, Javier. I appreciate it. Yeah, okay. Because we have a Lacanian scholar here, so I need to ask questions because I'll say for a bit more than. Okay, thank you, Dimitri. I know it's late for you. So I'm reading the section on fortune and spontaneity from Lacan, and I'm very surprised by what's being said here. I'm going to give you a quick summary of what I'm reading from that chapter. And yeah, I mean, Dimitri, let me know how this is a fair read. So he gives this distinction of these two terms, and fortune, right? The tiche is encounter with the real. The automaton is the insistence of the sign by which we see ourselves governed by the pleasure principle. And this fortune is a function of the real repetition as an encounter with trauma, which arouses attention, which is unassailable, like assimilatable to the analytic experience, because apparently this is a mode of apprehension that governs a new account of the subject's relations to that of virtue, all that causes the circumstances of the subject, which particularly the marking of the homeostasis, which orients the whole function within the pleasure principle. And then there's a kind of antagonism of this pleasure principle and the reality principle. And he goes further to say that and I'll just summarize one last part, which is this reality, its total, is in suspension in this place awaiting attention between as an experience of the rupture between perception and consciousness in a non-temporal locus, another locality, place, scene, which has constraints governed by the diversions of the primary process. I think this is really, I find this immensely entertaining. So let me ask you this question, Dimitri. What is the relation of the beautiful to trauma? Because one of the ways we talk about in this group about the beautiful is surprise. And we all acknowledge, because this comes from information theory, surprise, there's no guarantee that this is positive at all. There's no guarantee of that. There's plenty of most surprises actually biologically we're skewed against it. We're usually negatively skewed by it. Yeah, Lovecraft movie, right? So I just find this fascinating because the language Lacan is using it's very formal. It's very formally overlapping a lot of our commentary. But that's kind of this fortune with trauma and this kind of, and I think an area like we said internally in this group, the kind of strike of beauty that you must change your life in response to, that kind of change of and with the affection of the homeostasis in the subject. This is all our accounts we've been talking in this group. So it seems like at the core of the matter, this is touching on trauma and the beautiful. So I was going to ask you, Dimitri, if there's any other section I should read or we want to talk about, or that is even a fit. Is that a fair mapping? I guess that's basically my first question. And then if it's a fair mapping, where should we read more about this? Because I just have an interest. I'm just seeing so much overlap to our discussions in this group. So I'm going to stop with that.
I can recommend Science and Truth, which is where Lacan goes into Aristotelian causality. So that's another one to look at. I think that what Lacan doesn't want to reduce everything to efficient causality or mechanism, and he acknowledges Aristotle's move to that, there is something else. There's something which you can't reduce it to the three causes. But then for Lacan, it's not really that there is anything outside of mechanism, but it's that there is a hiccup within mechanism. And that this hiccup within mechanism is, you can say, patched up with final causality. But for Lacan, it's actually just a reflection, or like how do you say it, like an emanation or a shading of this hiccup. So yeah, trauma, like one of the ways to define it for Lacan is a trauma is not really an experience. Sometimes, people say, oh yeah, I've been traumatized, this, that. But for Lacan, trauma, like, okay, if I think about traumas that I've had, like I'm not going to go into detail, obviously, but like sexual traumas, things that shouldn't have happened at all. When I experience them and like afterwards, oftentimes I was like, I can take it. I'm a man, I'm like, I'm good, I can go on. And then later on, maybe weeks, maybe months, maybe years, I'm like, whoa, that shit fucking traumatized me. Like that shit, that was like, that made an impact on me, right? So trauma for Lacan is not something you experience, it's something where experience itself breaks down. Right, experience itself breaks down, but it's not just, and psychosis is actually a very interesting type of pathology, because psychosis, there is, crudely speaking, there's two phases in psychosis. So first of all, there is this breakdown of experience in psychosis, but second of all, the psychotic subject will try to, let's say, patch up that breakdown of reality, but it will be in a quirky way. It's like the subject is trying to heal themselves. The subject is trying to get back to reality, but it's knotting itself in a weird way that it's like, uh, yeah, I mean, for us neurotics, it's like, what the hell are you saying? Like, this is obviously not the case. But for the psychotic, it's like, it's a way for them to keep in touch with reality, actually. So there's these two phases of, like, there's the breakdown or the trauma, and then the way in which the trauma will be taken up. And for Lacan, the final cause would be such a thing. So I know I'm not directly responding to yeah, the way you are like quoting this passage. But yeah, these are some things to think about, So also something that's interesting about psychosis is that lots of times psychotic subjects experience their psychosis as a liberation, as an explosion of beauty, as a divine kind of intervention, or like of a experience themselves as a god, right? So the I mean, ecstasis, or like ecstasy, is an interesting word right here, because it's also like being about that, being beside yourself. But how can you be beside yourself? Well, this is actually split subjectivity that psychoanalysis is about, right? It's, you can see it very clearly if you take a certain angle, that yeah, there is split subjectivity in the ecstatic experience, in the being outside of it, or like being beside yourself, right? um yeah, so there's yeah, and I mean there's another way to relate this, which is it looks like I'm taking a different turn, but it's also related. So for psychoanalysis, Alenka Zupančič, she wrote this book called What is Sex, which is very good. But she talks about capitalism, and she talks about that capitalism is indeed like an invisible hand, right? It has like a kind of opaque mechanism, but somehow it works. Like market dynamics, it's nothing to scoff at. It's really kind of it's very special. But then she says that what happens is that this invisible hand of the market is not only an invisible hand, but it's like an invisible hand job in the sense that it will just be about the big number, and it's like 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 it starts being like a dick measuring contest in this sense. Right. So, and this is what billionaires actually do. A lot of them are like competing on who can have the most billions. For them, it's not really about like I'm really like basing myself on how rich people, from what I've seen from like very rich people and how they talk about things. Yeah, a point system. So Zupancic says that so there's like let's say the power of the other with the capital O, like capitalism. But then she says actually this invisible handjob of the market also goes together with masturbatory enjoyment, which is kind of solipsistic. So there's a very weird thing here that global capitalism and these big macroeconomic markets and mechanisms actually totally align with the most type of narcissistic, solipsistic enjoyment. Yeah, so yeah, that's it's a very strange thing, but yeah, so yeah, that's the thing about psychoanalysis. It's like the other is in a sense determining you, but it's when you actually uh, unplug from the big other, right, and kind of face your own anxiety that and basically let reality break down on its own accord instead of just like kind of violently keep asserting it. It's in these moments that we actually become a subject because we're not totally like engulfed in the other. So the other for psychoanalysis is actually masturbatory, right? It like hypes, mimesis. That's the other, but they're also like very much caught up in emotions, right? Very much caught like these algorithms and the hypes there and the like yeah, everything that we find. It's very masturbatory as well as narcissistic, but it's like it's got nothing to do with these people, right? Because it's depersonalized. So like in a sense you could say in psychoanalysis becoming a subject and facing that like self-relating negativity is also like, to put it in a more colloquial language, it's like building character, right? And I mean it's the weird paradox here is that you have to go through that process to see that process in other people, right? Like it's like take literature, which is a good example, like to yeah, for people who begin in literature, it's like what someone like Sophocles or Dante um, or like or, or like The Sound and the Fury. Like these stuffs, they can seem mediocre, but it's like once you go in the process and you look back, it's like you had to go through something to realize what's actually there, right? So that's really the crazy thing. It's like I think actually Daniel Gardner he's an exemplary case of subjectivity, like he's so free in his thought, in his art. Like it's so stellar what he's doing. And like he's not masturbatory at all, right? He's very open and he's not like he's kind of like unplugged from the other. Um he's not like plugged into that mimesis, which doesn't mean he's like not in mimesis, right? Like uh we all have our styles and yeah, styles are mimetic, right? They are mimetic phenomena of culture. So it's not about like becoming detached from everyone or something. But yeah, so these are just some pointers. I hope this helps.
Well, first, you're very kind, and I appreciate that. And well, some of the things that just come to mind, and please, Dimitri, I do know it is late. So, and Javier, if you have any more to say, and then I'll probably run and do chairs and different things like that. Um, one of the things I kind of think about, like Dimitri is saying, there's a way in which we can think of trauma as, just to use our language, trauma follows from a failed beauty, or it is what follows from a failed lost Geopadia. And that psychoanalysis, because there is this kind of idea that there's the lost, the return to the womb, there's something in childhood that was lost, and often we're trying to cover that or form our subjectivity. Like we form ourselves as subject in light of something that was kind of lost, right? That we start with, right? That we feel like, oh, as we grow up, we're like, when we were a kid, things were great. And there's some kind of genuineness. There's something about being a child that aligns with Geopadia. There's something that feels as if you had it and you lost it. And we can associate this with a loss of the beautiful. Well, we've also talked about that if you lose the beautiful, there's a terror that kind of develops, right? There's a kind of horror that develops. There's a question here to be said. Basically, psychoanalysis positions itself as if there is something about the formation of the subject that cannot be separated from a feeling of a loss. That something was lost that we may associate with a certain loss of the beautiful or a loss of the Geopadia. And so what ends up happening is there's something, if I were to speak, for me, and you may be interested, Jockin, I had the whole Lacan philosophy portal. Dimitri was wonderful. I did stuff on like Lacan and Dante, and of course I'm always going to do Dante and Lovecraft, trying to think Eros and Dante with the libidinal and Lacan and thinking some of these discourses together. Because for me, there is something about the encounter of the real and the beautiful that are tied together, but the relationship is very hard to kind of bring out. Because there's an idea of, thank you, Dimitri, because there's something about saying we don't want to equate the real with the beautiful, but there's something about the real can also be what occurs when the beautiful is lost or the Geopadic inverts and it becomes the evil in that sense, right? Like the real is sort of like a realization of the fragility of the beautiful, okay? Like that is like, and so if there is something where basically all human beings, as they grow up, develop with a sense of a loss. And it could just be when I was a kid, things were easy, I didn't have to work, things were taken care of me. It doesn't really matter. There's an idea in psychoanalysis that there is something that was lost. And it could be in the neurotic register, like you could turn to an authority to deal with this loss. It could be a psychotic register where you create a kind of individualistic egoic enclosure based on a groundlessness. And there's something about the psychotic that's actually getting to the truth of reality, which is that it is, in a sense, groundless. But then, of course, groundlessness can be sublated into gifting and other things in the definitive, as we've talked about. But there is something about psychoanalysis is basically forming as asking the question, how does subjectivity form in light of some sort of experience of a loss? With another way to look at that is how does subjectivity form with an experience of the beautiful inverting? Because we've talked about how the beautiful, if it inverts, becomes a terror. These things are all kind of related. And the claim of psychoanalysis that may or may not be true, but I think does have parallels in many religions with falling out of Eden. Everyone is fallen. There's a loss of something, right? There's an idea that all subjectivity of all human beings is formed relative to a fall, we could say in religious language, or relative to a loss, or something being no longer present. Now, you could argue that in a world that doesn't have the beautiful, if this is true, then psychoanalysis is all there is, actually. So this is why the recovery of the beautiful for me is a very big deal, because if there is no beautiful, if the beautiful has been collapsed into the good, well, then the psychoanalytical take is the take, right? Because we all have lost something, and then we're just coping with it, right? And look, Lacan himself, I think this is correct. He basically ends saying religion's going to win. Like, he's just like, look, psychoanalysis cannot give what religions can. There are problems identified in psychoanalysis, especially when we get to the social, and there will be a return to religion. Lacan's brother was a Catholic priest. Lacan's relationship with religion is very, very interesting. I can't say I'm an expert on it, but there is a sense where, I think it would be fair to say that Lacan himself basically would not have been surprised at all that psychoanalysis actually ultimately led people to returning into a church. He would be like, yeah, because ultimately what else you going to do? You know, that's just a fair direction. And you do see a lot of people turning from psychoanalysis back into church. Now, we could say it's a problematic point. It doesn't really matter. There's something in psychoanalysis that leaves other questions that have to be asked. But to the defense of psychoanalysis, and this is my take, in a world that doesn't have the beautiful, psychoanalysis is a pretty, like, that's a pretty good discourse to use if the beautiful is lost, because you're trying to understand how subjectivity forms in light of an experience of loss. Now, a key move that Lacan makes to deal with the loss is say the loss is actually a lack. The loss of the beautiful is actually it's more ontological. And I actually think it's fair to say it's ontological, in even the Lacanian sense, is that it is deeper. The lack is part of reality itself. Well, here's our potential, ladies and gentlemen. If we can then tie this lack to Aristotle, as we've talked about, because lack is not nothing, then that's where the psychoanalytical discourse can then it can lead into what I think it needs to lead toward. Because basically, psychoanalysis right now, for most of history, has been a conversation of how the subject forms with the loss of beauty. Because when you say the loss of Eden or the fall, it's basically the loss of beauty. And psychoanalysis is the study of how subjectivity forms in light of this. And the claim is the following, and this is very useful. The claim is all subjectivity forms in light of the loss of beauty. That's actually the claim. So right there, psychoanalysis becomes hyper useful for the argument that beauty is primary. Because you're saying the loss of beauty is the formation of the subject. Now, you use different languages, Eden, fall, whatever, but it is Geopadia, it's Holy Spirit, it's the Geopadia. You're saying the loss of some sort of childhood Eden is where subjectivity forms. And what Dimitri is saying that I agree with is basically there's a whole lot of strategies people do to cope with it. Pervert, neurotic, fascism, totalitarian, all of these are just strategies by which people are dealing with the problem of the loss of beauty, right? And so the key to understanding psychoanalysis, in my opinion, now again, this is my opinion, the key to understanding what online shopping, what psychoanalysis emerges from is it is a theory of understanding and living with the subject formed by the loss of beauty in a world that has forgotten beauty. Psychoanalysis is an understanding of the formation of the subject in light of the loss of beauty in a world that has forgotten beauty. And that's where we are. And so the recovery of beauty is then plugging in right into, okay, yeah, it's the loss of beauty, but now we've remembered it, and we can plug it into the question of lack and tie that to the partial object and the definitive and now think this all anew. And so that, to me, is getting at the relationship of psychoanalysis and Aristotle and beauty, et cetera, so forth, right? And then when we understand that all of these strategies of dealing with the loss of beauty then have political ramifications, because perverts are going X way, neurotics going to totalitarian, the psychotic might be going into a cheap delusionism or an anarchist fascism. Like this then leads to political consequence. And when also too, here's the other key, if the formation of the subject is all in light of the loss of beauty, well, guess what is going to be the most likely force of manipulation of subjects in the world today? It will be something like beauty that is not beauty, porn, algorithm, self-symmetry, the aesthetic that is not the beautiful, fungibility, exchangeability, efficiency, because there's something like beauty in efficiency, ergo capital comes in, and it offers the closest address. So then capital becomes a critical format. The algorithm becomes it easily slips in there and defines the subject, because the subject was formed from the loss of something like beauty. The algorithm is like beauty without being the beautiful, therefore it easily slips in, and that's where psychoanalysis becomes so interested in the formation of the subject in light of capital and ideology, because basically ideology is algorithmic logic, capital is algorithmic logic, it's all algorithm. I just call it Kafka-likeness. It's all algorithm. And so if the subject is formed by the loss of the Geopadia, it's actually subconsciously re-seeking it. And if the only thing on hand in a world without the beautiful is basically the algorithm, then that in all probability will become the main way that the subject is formed. That's just what's going to happen. And so then, for me, what this means is using psychoanalysis to move loss to lack, make it ontological, and then think about what is afforded by the ontological lack, where lack is not nothing. Well, actually, it's the Geopadia. But this is the key. Ontological lack only can actually find its fittedness in the social. Individually, it can't do it. Lack has to move to the social. Well, now it's the Geopadia. That's the only way that lack can actually be used properly. And so we have to move into that realm. And that's where the conversation is. And I am so sorry that I really do have to run. I've really enjoyed this. We'll talk more. I think the conversation is tremendous. And thank you all for being here. And indeed, these are wild times. So to unfolding chairs, life, and etc. Thank you all.